The president released a series of memos from the Bush administration regarding torture, what was considered to be torture, waterboarding.
Yeah.
Two-part question. Do you consider waterboarding torture or illegal? And if so, what would be the harm in holding hearings to find out what happened, why did this happen, and maybe holding some people accountable for this?
Well, of course you should. I don't know who the genius was in the room that night when they were discussing this. But if you're going to make the decision to release the documents, I presume every one of us here would then have a follow-on question, which is, what are you going to do with that information? And if the answer was, well, nothing, we're just going to release the documents, I'm amazed that someone wasn't in the room saying, well, wait a minute, you got a problem. You're going to release them. Then you're going to have to answer the next question. What are you going to do with it? Well, I believe that waterboarding is torture. And we now know it's in the public record. In one case, it was 183. How effective could that have been after the 90th waterboarding? When you know you're not, guys going, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable, but I'm not going to drown. And it seems to me there, Pat Leahy of Vermont, has been arguing for a select committee or a commission, I forget which he's talked about, to go and review all of this. I agree with him on that. There's some debate about whether he does it or the Intelligence Committee does it, but someone ought to do it. And then secondly, if people in fact did something that was illegal, they ought to be pursued. We talked about financial services in this area. I don't know how you answer the question. If you say to me, I'm releasing all the documentation which demonstrates this happening, and then the follow-on is, but we're not going to do anything about it. Now, I know people don't want to go back, and this gets uncomfortable in the presence. I don't want to look forward. You know, my father was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. They were not a popular idea. In fact, Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor of the United States at Nuremberg, got excoriated by his fellow justices on the Supreme Court for going. Winston Churchill said, let's just shoot everybody and forget about a trial. The Soviets were much more progressive. They said, well, have a show trial for a week and then shoot everybody. They were the liberals in it. But my father's point, actually, Henry Stimson, who was the only Republican in Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, the Secretary of War, was the great advocate of the Nuremberg trials, along with a few others. And their point was, no, we're different. There is a thing called the rule of law. And these guys, these thugs, this wasn't just war, terrible things happened in war. 6 million Jews were incinerated. A total of 11 gypsies, gays, Catholics, others, the total were literally incinerated or mass executions. This wasn't just war. 55 million people died as a result of their aggressive behavior. To say, we're just going to kind of wash our hands. There's a great opening line, or one of the opening lines of Robert Jackson at the Nuremberg trials, which I memorized a long time ago, because it captured the whole essence of it. And it's talking about the Soviet Union in those days, the British, the French, and ourselves. The line Jackson used was that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stayed the hand of vengeance by voluntarily submitting their captive enemies to the judgment of the rule of law, the greatest tribute that power ever paid to reason. And that captured the essence of Nuremberg, power paying tribute to reason. In a sense, not to prosecute people or pursue them when these acts have occurred is instead to invite it again in some future administration. If you think it doesn't mean anything, that you can basically do what you want on this thing, and somehow we'll just say, well, that was yesterday, today's today. Had that handful of people who advocated the Nuremberg trials embraced that view, Nuremberg became the symbol of who we were. Even these thugs got a lawyer. Even these thugs had a trial, despite their acts. And so we became a symbol of jurisprudence of the rule of law. Now, unfortunately, Guantanamo's taken over for that symbol, what it symbolizes who we are, or Abu Ghraib, in a way. And I think we need to get back to that moral high ground again of what we stand for. This stuff wasn't just written for us if you happen to live here. The concepts embraced in that organic document of our country are rights that you're endowed with by your creator. Everybody is, not just those who are lucky enough to live here. Now, we don't apply those legally to everybody around the world, but the essence of them was these are fundamental rights of human beings. And when they're violated, as they have been, then I think you have an obligation to stand up and support the efforts to pursue those who do the violation.
So even if it goes up as high as, a lot of this stuff seems to point towards Cheney's office.
You got to go where you got to go.
Okay.